In today's lesson we're going to look at London by William Blake, which is a poem from the GCSE English Literature, Power and Conflict cluster. If you'd like to follow along with the annotations, or if you'd like to make any notes, you might find it useful to have paper or notebook, something to write with and a highlighter for when we start to analyse the poem. As part of today's lesson we're going to go over some context about the poet himself. We're then going to look at some of the terminology and some of the vocab that we come across in the poem. We'll then break down how to annotate poetry. We're then going to look at analysing the poem itself under the visualiser, and then at the very end I'm going to show you some exam style questions of what you could expect to be asked about this poem. Okay, so first of all some context about William Blake himself. So William Blake was an English poet, he was also a painter and a printmaker. He was born in 1757, so the Industrial Revolution was something that was taking place in his lifetime, and it's one of the central ideas of the poem. The Industrial Revolution, in short, was a time where we saw huge advances in machinery and in the manufacturing process. This led to a vast increase in the population, especially in places like London. However, there was a lack of resources to go around. This in turn meant that there was then a big divide between rich and poor, and there was an ever-growing gap in social status. So for most people in London during the Industrial Revolution, life was very difficult. It wasn't uncommon that people would have to work 19-hour days in very poor conditions and for very little pay. As we'll see in the poem, Blake highlights the selfishness and the ignorance of the monarchy and those in power, and he ultimately declares that they should take responsibility for the social and economic injustice that he sees in London. Next then are some pieces of vocabulary and terminology that I'll keep referring to as part of the analysis. Like I just mentioned, the Industrial Revolution, a transition towards widespread manufacturing processes, is referenced a lot in the poem. A stanza is simply just a verse of poetry. A rhyme scheme is the pattern of rhyme that lines of poetry follow. Anaphora is where we see the repetition of the start of lines. A metaphor is a figure of speech, likening one thing to another. Lastly, an oxymoron is combining two contradictory terms. So for example, deafening silence. Here's how I'd approach annotating poetry, and feel free to pause the video here and have a go at doing this with London next to you if you have a copy. This list will also be helpful in the future when you start to look at unseen poetry as well. So if I was annotating a poem that I hadn't read before or was unfamiliar or challenging to me in some way, I'd follow these steps to try and break down some sort of meaning behind it. So first I'll have a look at the title and what might be implied by it. And then I'd read through the poem and perhaps have a highlighter or a pen in hand to make notes about anything that's happening. If there's any words or phrases that I know the meaning of and I'm familiar with, I'd make a note of that as well and what that might suggest. I might then look at whether the poem has any recurring themes. I then look at the perspective as well about who's talking to us in the poem. Is it implied that it's the poet themselves, or is it somebody else that they're using as a voice for the poem? I then look at the structure. And again, what does that suggest? Is there something about line length, about rhyme scheme, about how many stanzas there are? Are there any stanzas at all? That sort of thing. And lastly, I then go into the language analysis. I'd look at any word choices that the poet has made, any devices that they've used, and what they suggest. Okay, so let's start to annotate the poem. I'm going to refer back to our list earlier and follow that as a step-by-step of how we're going to approach the analysis of this poem. So first we're going to look at the title, which is obviously London. We have some sort of context we can link back to at the start, so I'm going to make a note that we're going to expect to see something to do with the Industrial Revolution. Our next step then was to read through the poem once with a highlighter or a pen in hand, and we're going to make some notes about the meaning of the words and phrases that we come across. So I'm going to read each stanza, there are 4 of them in total, and then break down some of the vocab that we come across in each of the stanzas. So our first one then: I wander through its chartered streets, near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet, marks of weakness, marks of woe. I'm going to pick out a few words here. I'm going to look at the very first word, I, which we know is a first person pronoun, which means we can imply that it's Blake himself talking to us. So it implies it's Blake's own experiences that we're talking about here. I'm also going to look at the word wonder as well. To me that sounds like he's walking around with no real purpose. He sounds like he's aimlessly making his way around the city. We then see this part at the end of the stanza. It says, "And mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe." It's significant here, and we'll see in the next stanza as well, the repetition of the word every, and these two emotions that are implied here, weakness and woe. We get the sense from the opening stanza that people in London in general aren't very happy. And again, from what we looked at earlier, we could link this back to context here. This could imply that we're talking about the consequences of the Industrial Revolution again. I'll read stanza number 2 to you next. "In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, the mind-forged manacles I hear." So again, we have the word every repeated. And we know from the vocab earlier, we've got this repetition at the start of lines. So this is an example of anaphora. The repetition here of the word every, after we had it in stanza 1, really reinforces that this is everyone that it affects, and that's irrespective of how old they are. We have the mention of man in the first line and infants in the second line as well, implying that it's impacting everybody from the start of their lives to the end of their lives. There's another word here I'm going to pick out, manacles, which we don't really hear of much these days, but these essentially are old-fashioned handcuffs, the ones that you'd see sort of prisoners wearing, where they're tied with their arms and legs. Which implies that they're restrained in some way. Stanza number 3 then. "How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls." So again here we see reference to the sheer number of people that are affected by it, and perhaps some of this reference to the injustice of what's happening in London at the time as well. Chimney sweepers typically would be younger children, which, as we saw from the Industrial Revolution context, they would usually be working in very poor conditions. We also see in this stanza reference to some of the institutions that might hold some responsibility for this, particularly in this last line with "runs in blood down palace walls." That's definitely a word that stands out to me in this stanza. Palace walls, we obviously know that's where kings and queens live, is where the monarchy live. Our last stanza then. "But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlots curse, blast the newborn infant's tear, and blights with plagues the marriage hearse." So again we have reference to different ages of people here. We've got youthful harlots and newborn children, which again links us back to this early idea that it's everyone that's being affected by this. So that was for that second question, and I just picked out some of the words that stood out to me in the poem and started to look at what they might imply. We'll go into a bit more detail shortly for question number 6 about what devices have been used, what words have been used, and what they actually imply. For our third question though, it says, "Does the poem have any recurring themes?" And I'm going to make a note at the top of the poem to themes. We definitely get the sense from the opening stanza, particularly these last 2 lines, that suffering is a theme. That's then further reinforced with cry in the second stanza, for both the man and the infant, and reference to these manacles as well. And when we move down to our third stanza, where we have this reference to the monarchy, that starts to tie in the theme of some sort of abuse of power, or that those in charge aren't taking responsibility for what's happening to the people of London. We also might have the theme of injustice in the poem as well. We know that lots and lots of people are affected by what's happening in London, particularly to do with the Industrial Revolution, but it seems like Blake is implying that those that are living in palaces, those that are in power, aren't affected by that injustice. They still live quite a comfortable life in comparison to most people that are living in London at the time. Okay, back to our question list then. So for our next one, we'll consider the perspective and who is the speaker. So as we picked out at the start, the use of the first person pronoun implies that it's Blake's own experience, it's him talking to us. And as we know from our context, we know that William Blake grew up when the Industrial Revolution was taking place and didn't like what he saw as a consequence for this. For question number 5 then, we're going to look at how the poem is structured. And here we can see that the poem has 4 stanzas in total. And each of those stanzas has 4 lines each. If we look towards the end of our lines as well, we can also see that the poem follows quite a strict rhyme scheme. We have street and meet, flow and woe, man and ban, fear and hear. That's consistent throughout the poem. Every other line rhymes. Line 1 and 3 always rhyme in each stanza, and line 2 and 4 always rhyme in each stanza as well. So this is what we call a alternate rhyme scheme, where every other line rhymes. This stands out as something that could be quite significant because it's quite a strict set of rules, if you like, that the poem follows. The 4 stanzas, the 4 lines per stanza, and the rhyme scheme that doesn't change throughout the poem. Blake might have done this to suggest that for the people living in London, it's very difficult for them to escape this rigid structure that's been put in place by those in power. Okay, lastly on our set of questions then, we're going to have a look at the use of language, any word choices or devices that might have been used and what they might imply. I'm going to start by going back to this last line of the second stanza, the mind-forged manacles that I hear. We know from earlier that manacles is just an old-fashioned way of saying handcuffs, those ones that are from your arms to your legs, and that means that if you're manacled, you're going to be restrained in some way. If we look at the word before it there, it says mind-forged. So these aren't physical manacles, it's not a physical restriction on the people, it's something that's they carry with them. So this use of metaphor could suggest that for the people of London, poverty and injustice, as it is at the minute, is very difficult to escape from. I'm also going to look back to this line from the end of stanza number 3, runs in blood down palace walls. And we spoke about earlier how this refers to the monarchy, as they're usually the people that live in palaces, or certainly those in charge anyway. This isn't literally happening, there's not literally blood running down their walls, but it's metaphorical. And here Blake might be suggesting that those in charge, those with power, should have some sort of responsibility for what's happening. And if we look back to this last stanza, we picked out that this could link back to that anaphora from earlier of in every, and we see this with the youthful harlots and newborn children. We also have the reference to man earlier, which is implying that throughout all stages of life, people are affected by this, and that creates some sort of cycle of poverty that the people are living in, or a cycle of suffering. So he's perhaps implying here that things as they are at the moment won't change. There'll be this constant cycle of those that are born into poverty and grow up in poverty will continue to live in poverty throughout adulthood and have children that will have similar experiences as they grow up. And linking back to our theme of injustice, we don't see that with those that have power, those that have wealth, those that have profited from the Industrial Revolution. For the last part of our language analysis then, we have this oxymoron used at the end, marriage hearse. Marriage is usually a symbol of hope and things to come and something that's long term, whereas hearse marks the end of something as something that's short and quite permanent. And again, this could link back to this idea of this cycle of people not being able to escape from the circumstances that they're in, and they're going to have children that are going to experience the same as they grow up. To summarise then, we know from our context that the poem has this central theme of the Industrial Revolution, with other themes of suffering, abuse of power and injustice as a consequence of these things. As we look deeper into the individual stanzas in the poems, we notice that Blake starts to see that everybody in London is suffering and people aren't happy in general. He's walking around aimless and he lacks purpose. Perhaps he's disheartened by what he can see happening in the city. He uses devices like repetition and anaphora to highlight that this is affecting everybody, or certainly everybody that he sees anyway. And he uses a metaphor, mind-forged manacles, to imply that the people he sees that are suffering and are in poverty are stuck in that situation. As we go to our third stanza, we see that Blake starts to refer to the monarchy in an effort to imply they should be taking responsibility, or they're responsible for the things that are happening in London. And he uses this metaphor of runs in blood, like having blood on your hands, that you should feel guilty, you should take responsibility for something. And in our last stanza, he really highlights that this is a cycle that people can't break, that those in power have created this situation and they're ignorant and selfish and feel indifferent towards the poverty and the suffering that's happening in the city at the time. Lastly then, I've put together 3 questions that focus on the central themes in the poem. And although the exam will ask you to compare one poem to another, these are still useful to practice, so you get used to writing about themes and you get used to writing about the poems. So 3 questions we've got are: how does Blake present ideas about suffering in London? How does Blake present ideas about the abuse of power in London? And how does Blake present ideas about the power of institutions in London? Those are obviously 3 very prominent themes throughout the poem. And as we look at more of the poems in the anthology, we'll see that lots of these themes carry over into those poems as well. And lastly, well done for taking part in this video lesson. Remember, every bit of revision you do from now up until the end of your exams will be useful. I've been Tom, thank you for watching.